Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez informed a Senate committee that she consistently battles on behalf of working-class households. She stated that she formerly made a living as a bartender. She expressed that she intimately understands the experience of relying on gratuities, stressing over monthly lease payments, and questioning whether the broader establishment even acknowledges one's existence. The individual seated directly opposite her was Senator Marco Rubio. His own father had been employed as a bartender for 3 full decades. Furthermore, his mother had labored as a housekeeper in a hotel. They departed from Cuba possessing absolutely nothing, dedicating the remainder of their existence to manual labor specifically so their offspring would be spared from such toil. The Congresswoman served beverages for a single season prior to launching her congressional campaign. Conversely, Rubio's father served beverages for his entire existence because that profession was his entire livelihood. When Rubio eventually produced an aging photograph of his parents wearing their occupational uniforms and delivered a mere 10 words directly to her face, Ocasio-Cortez shut her folder and did not utter a single additional syllable. Those specific 10 words are located at the conclusion of this narrative. Upon hearing them, you will entirely comprehend why she was rendered completely speechless. However, those 10 words arrived at the very end. The preceding 29 minutes serve as the fundamental reason this encounter is worth recounting. The Congresswoman entered the room carrying a thick, polished folder and highlighted 3 distinct accomplishments she told the panel she took the most pride in: obstructing Amazon from establishing a presence in her district, advancing the Green New Deal, serving as a vocal advocate for working-class families. Rubio quietly absorbed her statements. He possessed a small pocket-sized notepad, resembling the type a server utilizes to record customer orders. He transcribed each of her points across 3 small lines, utilizing unhurried, meticulous handwriting. Upon her conclusion, he retracted his pen and placed it down with the deliberate manner of a person resting their cutlery before articulating a deeply considered thought. And then he looked up. "I'd like to go through them," he recited directly from his notepad, repeating her exact phrasing with near-perfect accuracy. "I protected my community from being exploited." That is precisely what you stated, Congresswoman. Your legislative district encompasses sections of the Bronx and Queens. Is that accurate? That is correct, Ocasio-Cortez affirmed. And during 2019, Amazon publicized its intention to construct a secondary headquarters in Long Island City located in Queens, which is within your district. I am thoroughly aware of that, Senator. Rubio slightly lowered the volume of his voice. 25,000 employment opportunities boasting an average annual compensation of $150,000 for the exact demographic you just informed this panel you advocate for. The chamber was not completely devoid of sound. The ventilation systems hummed quietly. A photography device clicked faintly from the rear of the room, yet the atmosphere adopted that distinct heavy anticipation that emerges when an audience senses an impending impact. Ocasio-Cortez leaned closely into her microphone. This specific topic was her preferred battleground. She had engaged in this exact dispute across various television networks, social media platforms, and public forums. She possessed a fully prepared retort. Senator, those consisted of public subsidies. $3 billion of taxpayer capital allocated for the most affluent corporation in human history. Jeff Bezos did not require a financial handout. Our educational institutions required those funds. The local transit authority needed those funds. The small, independent businesses in my district needed. Congresswoman, he interrupted. She paused. This was not because he elevated his volume, but rather because he decreased it. What transpired after Amazon withdrew? She blinked rapidly. The inquiry was almost confusingly straightforward. They did not build. They refrained from building in your district, Rubio clarified. However, did they still relocate to New York? A brief moment of hesitation followed. Her fingertips grazed the edge of her folder. Amazon rented commercial property in Manhattan, she conceded. How many positions? 1,500. Rubio echoed the figure back to her. 1,500. Instead of 25,000. 1,500 and located not in Queens nor in the Bronx, but in Manhattan, completely outside your jurisdiction. He directed his gaze back to his notepad. And were they granted any financial subsidies for those 1,500 roles? Ocasio-Cortez's tone grew noticeably softer. No. Therefore, Amazon established a presence in New York regardless without any subsidies. This is precisely the result you claimed you desired, except rather than 25,000 jobs remaining in your district, 1,500 were awarded to a different constituency entirely. He allowed that reality to linger, akin to leaving a restaurant bill resting on the table when the final sum exceeds expectations. Congresswoman, you published on social media that the Amazon agreement was a concession to, and I am quoting directly here, robber baron billionaires. You argued that the capital ought to be redirected to the transit authority and public educational facilities. He raised his eyes. Did it? Absolute silence from the Congresswoman. Her palm rested flatly against the surface of her folder. Did the transit system receive that $3 billion, Congresswoman? Did the local schools? That capital was never. It was never actual money. That is the correct response. Rubio offered a faint expression resembling a smile. Not a genuine smile, but rather a trace of one the specific expression an educator displays when a pupil ultimately articulates the precise truth they have been circumventing for 20 minutes. There was no $3 billion resting in a municipal treasury waiting to be allocated toward public housing. Those were merely tax incentives distributed over a 25-year span, entirely conditional upon Amazon genuinely constructing facilities and employing personnel. Her eyes fell toward the folder, not to review its contents, but to focus on any location other than his visage. You informed your voters that you were safeguarding their financial resources. There were no financial resources to safeguard, yet there were 25,000 actual jobs. Those were tangible. Up in the viewing area, a mature woman seated in the second row offered a singular nod. She was in her late 60s, with reading spectacles tucked into her hair. It was a subtle nod, the distinct gesture individuals make when they hear an undeniable truth they inherently recognized but had never witnessed anyone publicly articulate. Rubio completed that page of his notepad and flipped to the subsequent one, displaying the methodical manner of a patron turning a receipt to verify the itemized charges. However, he did not immediately transition to the Green New Deal. He ventured into more damaging territory. Congresswoman, during September of 2021, you participated in the Met Gala. Admittance required $35,000 per attendee. You donned a pristine designer gown displaying the phrase, "Tax the rich," emblazoned across the rear. He kept his eyes lowered. He recited directly from his notes, his delivery curt and unadorned, much like a standard invoice. The House Ethics Committee scrutinized your participation. This was not a right-wing organization, nor a partisan think tank. It was the bipartisan House Ethics Committee, comprised of both Democrats and Republicans. He flipped another page. They determined you received a bespoke designer dress and failed to remit full payment for it. Your personnel explicitly requested the creator to reduce the borrowing fee from the $300 down to $30. An individual in the gallery let out a breath. It was the specific kind of exhalation that barely suppresses a spoken reaction. They concluded you accepted a complimentary pass for your romantic partner, a $35,000 value that directly breached congressional gift regulations. Ocasio-Cortez grasped her microphone. Those were merely administrative delays. My staff, the committee mandated you to remit an extra $2,700. Members of your own political faction endorsed that conclusion. $2,700. To provide context, the admission you obtained entirely free was valued at $35,000. The penalty for violating the regulations cost less than the event's appetizers. He refused to let her interject. He pressed forward, and this marked the juncture where the proceeding transitioned from merely awkward to something profoundly different. Your primary administrative aide, Saikat Chakrabarty, managed a pair of political action committees. The Federal Election Commission obtained a grievance claiming that approximately $900,000 was shifted from those PACs into privately held corporations that Mr. Chakrabarty also directed. The rhythm of her breathing shifted. It didn't accelerate, it became shallower. It was the distinct respiration pattern of an individual attempting desperately to appear as though they are breathing normally. Corporations that, contrary to PACs, possess no obligation to disclose their financial expenditures. Somewhere in the spectator area, a writer ceased scribbling. The assistant positioned behind the senator leaned forward slightly. Your chief of staff relinquished his position during the midst of the federal inquiry. That statement required no embellishment. It was inherently devastating, much like a visible fracture spreading across safety glass. He finally raised his eyes from the small pad. You sported an outfit demanding the taxation of the wealthy to an exclusive $35,000 gathering, violating ethical guidelines in the process. Your top aide transferred almost $1 million through obscure shell corporations and departed before the probe concluded. He placed his writing instrument down. Congresswoman, when you declare that you battle for working-class households, is this truly what that battle resembles? Her folder remained open on the desk. Her fingertips lingered on the divider labeled green. She refrained from turning the leaf. "Let us now discuss the Green New Deal," he proposed, reciting her statements back to her one more time. He maintained the same subdued tone and the same methodical handwriting, presenting the notes like undeniable proof of purchase. "The premier climate policy architecture operating at the magnitude the emergency necessitates." Those are your words. You articulated them mere minutes ago. She adjusted her posture, sitting taller. If the corporate subsidy dispute was a battle she had previously waged, this topic was the conflict she felt destined for. The Green New Deal formed the absolute core of her public persona. It was the catalyst that transformed a novice representative into a cultural force. She elevated her chin, her hand departed from the folder. "The Green New Deal represents the most sweeping climate blueprint ever proposed within this legislative body," she declared. It ignited a nationwide dialogue regarding— Rubio abruptly interrupted. "Congresswoman, what is the total expense?" "It represents a non-binding declaration of principles. It does not carry a specific monetary value." Rubio angled his head. It was the exact tilt a mechanic displays when a client insists a severely damaged motor sounds perfectly normal. Neutral evaluators projected the total expenditure to reach as high as $93 trillion, yet you are asserting to this panel that it requires zero funding? She leaned assertively toward her microphone. "Because it is strictly non-binding, Senator. It serves as a declaration of—" and for a brief moment, that defense almost succeeded. Theoretically, non-binding resolutions do not authorize actual spending. It was precisely the type of rhetorical maneuver that proves victorious during brief television segments where the broadcast concludes before probing questions can be asked. Up in the gallery, several individuals tilted their heads slightly, demonstrating the reaction people have when a concept appears logical but remains mathematically unverified. Ocasio-Cortez recognized this. She sensed the audience's momentum sway slightly in her favor for a fraction of a second, and she pressed her advantage. "It serves as a declaration of principles, a strategic orientation. In the identical manner that the Marshall Plan commenced as a rhetorical address prior to evolving into enacted legislation." That was a highly effective counter. It was the exact style of intellectual pivot she excelled at, equating her proposal with a historical triumph, categorizing it as ideological vision rather than fiscal drainage. Had her opponent been less astute, she might have escaped unharmed. Rubio, however, was highly astute. "You informed us barely half a minute ago that this constituted the premier climate framework operating at the magnitude the emergency necessitates. Not merely a declaration of principles, but an architecture operating at scale." He rested his pen. "Congresswoman, which description is accurate? Does it represent the comprehensive architecture destined to revolutionize the nation? Or is it merely a costless document that achieves absolutely nothing? Because it is logically impossible to be both." The audience momentum that had briefly swayed toward her instantaneously reverted, and this time it remained firmly with the senator. She parted her lips to speak, then closed them. Her folder remained open before her, yet her gaze avoided the text. This is the inherent danger of traps constructed from a person's own rhetoric. They do not appear threatening while being spoken. They feel like triumphant declarations. The Congresswoman had entered the chamber armed with 3 triumphs she had personally selected, and Rubio was wielding them against her with the precision of a master locksmith, utilizing her vocabulary guided by his strategy. "Allow me to provide some clarity," Rubio offered. "Your personal chief of staff granted an interview to the Washington Post. He explicitly stated that the Green New Deal was not initially conceived as an environmental initiative whatsoever. He stated, and I am quoting verbatim, 'We genuinely view it as a how do you overhaul the entire economic system initiative.'" The spectator gallery lacked the polite stillness typical of a legislative session. It possessed the tense stillness of an audience observing someone realize, in real time, that their closest ally had been contradicting them behind closed doors. Therefore, your most prominent advisor admitted to the media that the core objective was not preserving the environment. The objective was fundamentally reorganizing the United States economy. When you positioned yourself before this press and assured the public this was an environmental crusade, was your primary aide deceiving everyone, or were you? Her jaw clenched. It was a subtle tightening, the specific variety of physical tension only noticeable in tight camera shots when an individual is exerting massive effort to maintain a composed expression. "My staff member's interpretation was published in the Washington Post, Congresswoman. This does not constitute partisan opposition research. This originates from your personal staff. He progressed to the next page, initiating what appeared to observers as a secondary offensive in a conflict that was already deteriorating rapidly for her. An independent, nonpartisan analysis conducted by Vanderbilt University evaluated the legislative efficacy of all serving members of the House of Representatives. He looked up from his documentation. You authored 21 substantive pieces of legislation. 0 advanced through their respective committees. 0 secured a vote on the House floor. 0 were signed into law. Her chin descended fractionally. It was not an affirmative nod, it was the absolute inverse of a nod. It was the involuntary physical reaction occurring when one's head suddenly feels burdened by an immense weight. Among every single Democratic representative in the legislature, you placed near the absolute bottom. Among every Democratic member hailing from New York, you placed dead last. In the space behind the senator, an aide gently shut a document file, mimicking the caution of someone closing a portal they dare not let disturb the events unfolding inside. Your peer, Rashida Tlaib, belongs to the identical party, the identical caucus, the identical ideological faction. She successfully had a bill codified into law, operating within the identical system, Congresswoman, facing the identical hurdles, yet producing distinctly different outcomes. She grabbed her microphone. The legislative apparatus is inherently structured to I am not challenging the apparatus. I am simply reciting your performance record. He hesitated, not for theatrical effect. Rather, it was the specific hesitation a builder displays prior to informing a property owner that their structural base is fractured. Congresswoman, I am not interrogating your motives. I am evaluating your actual outcomes. Her binder remained parted, yet she had ceased referring to it entirely. 2 of the 3 primary accomplishments she had proudly presented to the panel were currently dismantled on the desk, resembling voided receipts for goods that never arrived. Rubio had systematically crossed them out within his notepad, using the same writing instrument, employing the identical deliberate, small lettering. A single line persisted. The final claim. I advocate for working families. I was employed as a bartender. I comprehend their struggles. He had not yet engaged that specific point. Observing the cautious, purposeful manner in which he handled the small notepad, similar to how one handles a volume containing a pressed object thicker than standard paper, made it explicitly clear that he did not simply intend to cross this final point out. He intended to obliterate it entirely. If you assume the preceding exchanges were the most brutal, remain attentive. Rubio was preparing to cease his inquiries, and his alternative approach fundamentally altered the room's atmosphere in a manner permanently etched into the memories of all attendees. She refused to wait for his next probe. This detail is crucial because the subsequent events deviated entirely from her prepared materials. It was not sourced from the binder. This was the Congresswoman operating at her most perilous, unrehearsed, backed into a corner and retaliating with the sole remaining ammunition, the unvarnished reality concerning the politicians seated opposite her. She leaned aggressively forward. Her hands completely abandoned the folder. For the initial time during the proceeding, she locked eyes with the senator in the precise, confrontational manner she utilized against adversaries on broadcast television. Direct, rapid, deeply focused. Senator, you wish to discuss working-class families? Let us indeed discuss working-class families. Her vocal pitch lowered significantly, her chin leveled, and she pressed firmly against the backrest of her seat, mirroring a combatant solidifying their stance to halt a retreat. Your parents immigrated from Cuba. And the political faction you belong to. The faction you serve as a representative for. The faction you actively collect donations for. The faction whose policies you endorse has forcibly divided migrant families at the national boundary. Incarcerated minors in enclosures. Senator, you are acutely aware of this. The spectator gallery reacted a subdued resonance, not quite a whisper, but rather the collective auditory consequence of bodies adjusting their posture. You stated you were the child of a bartender. You confirmed that. You have repeated it during every single electoral race you have ever participated in. Yet your political party systematically rejected enhancements to the minimum wage for bartenders, for servers, for kitchen staff. Every single instance it reached the voting floor. Every single instance. She was no longer reciting prepared remarks. She had dropped the performance. She was delivering verbal strikes with unfiltered intensity, and every single blow was landing effectively. So you presume to educate me regarding the working class? She leaned even further forward. Senator, I was working class. You merely descended from it. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically, not in favor of the senator, It surged toward her. The shift was palpable within the gallery, evident in the swiveling of heads and the way the senator's assistant adjusted his seating position. For the first instance during the entire proceeding, the Congresswoman commanded the momentum. She controlled the chamber. That concluding phrase lingered in the atmosphere, identical to how a devastating physical strike resonates after connecting, during that brief interval before anyone ascertains if the recipient will manage to stand back up. This represented the critical juncture. Those familiar with these types of political proceedings understand that this is the precise moment. Battles are decided not based on factual data, but on the capacity to recover. A less capable interrogator would have immediately retaliated, attempted to shield his party, refuted the allegations, and permanently surrendered control of the room. Retaliatory denial immediately following a devastating critique appears exactly as weak as it truly is. Rubio refrained from retaliating. He directed his gaze downward at his notepad. His writing instrument remained resting on the desk. He refrained from retrieving it. His right palm lay flat adjacent to it, fingers completely immobile. He inhaled a breath that was visually apparent but entirely silent. Subsequently, he raised his gaze. The Congresswoman is accurate regarding a specific point. The gallery became completely silent. It was not the artificial silence of a political venue anticipating a rehearsed slogan. It was genuine silence. The specific silence that manifests when an individual voices something entirely unanticipated. My political faction has not perpetually possessed the correct approach regarding immigration. I have articulated that sentiment openly on multiple occasions. I endeavored to rectify it. The Gang of Eight legislation during 2013. Certain individuals within my own faction have never pardoned me for that effort. The Congresswoman is aware of this reality. He allowed the concession to resonate, absorbing the critique without feigning that it had missed its mark. However, there exists a profound distinction between flawed legislative strategy and mere political theater. He retrieved his pen, pinching it between two fingers, gesturing toward empty space. I successfully championed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, representing the most significant pivot in American-Chinese diplomacy in several decades. That is not a social media post, that is codified law. I championed the Hong Kong Relations Act. That is codified law. I championed the Verdad Act. That is codified law. A flawed political faction, Congresswoman, but genuine legislative outcomes. He deposited the pen on the desk once more. You proclaimed your working-class status. I trust your assertion. My inquiry does not concern whether you belong to that class. My inquiry centers on what you accomplished using that background. Because I can demonstrate exactly what I accomplished using mine. The room's momentum did not violently snap back to the senator. It transitioned gradually, akin to the slow turning of ocean tides. One cannot perceive the exact millisecond it alters, but the sensation of water shifting beneath one's feet becomes undeniable. And upon looking down, one realizes they have been transported to a completely different location. She reclined into her seat. Her palm reverted to the folder, though it merely rested upon the exterior cover. It resembled a hand placed upon a portal one has abandoned any intention of unlocking. She had discharged her most potent ammunition, and it had not missed its target. Elements of her attack had landed successfully, and elements of it were factually accurate. However, the inherent nature of factual accuracy during a hearing is that it solely prevails if the opposing entity proves incapable of absorbing the damage. And Rubio had successfully absorbed it. Much like a solid structure absorbs a physical blow, the structure absorbs the kinetic energy, remains entirely upright, and leaves the attacker with an injured appendage. He advanced to the final page of his notepad. He moved slowly, and his hand paused upon an object concealed between the leaves. An item distinct from the paper itself, possessing borders visible beneath the translucent page. The final point of contention was approaching, and the manner in which the senator deployed it forms the core justification for conveying this narrative. A brief interlude existed between the preceding events and the impending climax, a span of several seconds characterized by total immobility. The gallery remained occupied processing her intense rebuttal. The recording equipment maintained its tight focus from her earlier confrontation. The atmospheric energy within the chamber felt highly unstable, mirroring the barometric pressure changes occurring between two colliding weather systems during a lull in the wind. He flipped the notepad open to its concluding page. He stared at it for an extended duration, a pause far lengthier than any prior response during the session had necessitated. And upon finally vocalizing his thoughts, The entire room comprehended that all previous interactions had merely served as preliminary groundwork. When he commenced speaking again, his demeanor had completely transformed. His vocal pitch was deeper, his rhythm had altered. The notepad rested open before him, yet he had ceased reciting its contents. For the initial time throughout the entire proceeding, Marco Rubio was no longer interrogating her. He was conveying a narrative. Congresswoman, you cataloged 3 specific matters you take pride in. I have addressed the first 2. The final one was this. He cast a brief glance toward his notes, a final visual check before raising his eyes. I advocate for working families. I was employed as a bartender. I comprehend their struggles. He permitted those phrases to linger. Then he initiated a topic entirely unanticipated by anyone present. My father worked as a bartender. Not as a precursor to a different career, not as a temporary transitional phase, but as his permanent existence. He managed the bar at the Mayfair House Hotel located in Miami. Prior to that, at Sam's Town, situated in Las Vegas, he dispensed beverages and cleared glassware, returning home carrying the scent of strangers' evenings for 3 decades. Her gaze shifted downward toward the empty desk surface. She avoided the folder, focusing instead on the barren wood, a location devoid of anything physical to grasp. My mother served as a housekeeper. Imperial Palace Hotel in Las Vegas, subsequently working as a retail stock clerk at Kmart until her retirement in 1995. She organized strangers' linens and replenished strangers' retail displays, and not once throughout her entire existence did she organize a media event to announce it. Up in the gallery, the mature woman seated in the second row removed her reading spectacles, resting them gently on her lap. She refrained from putting them back on. They emigrated from Cuba, not due to starvation, but because they were dictated to regarding what they were permitted to think. My grandfather rested on a patio in Miami decades later and recounted to me exactly what transpired, explaining what communism truly wrought, not the academic theory, but the harsh reality. Ocasio-Cortez's physical posture shifted. Her shoulders settled downward. They were not relaxed, simply lowered. It is the specific physical deflation that occurs when an individual abandons their defensive posture and prepares to simply endure an incoming barrage. The local residents who vanished, the commercial enterprises that were confiscated. That exact instant, you recognize that the state apparatus does not operate on your behalf. Rather, you operate on behalf of the state. And the solitary remaining question is the degree of your silence. He had ceased looking in her direction. His gaze was fixed on a vacant space situated between his microphone and the desktop. It is the characteristic stare of an individual witnessing historical events invisible to everyone else in the room. He subsequently refocused his attention. Congresswoman, you possess membership in the Democratic Socialists of America. Is that accurate? Her shoulders slightly retracted. I am. During 2021, the DSA, your specific organization, ratified a declaration during its National Assembly expressing solidarity with the Cuban Socialist Campaign, simultaneously condemning what they labeled acts of imperialist aggression directed against Cuba. He was not reciting this from his notes. He possessed this knowledge internally. Your organization pledged solidarity with the exact regime that stripped my family of everything they owned. The room froze. The entire chamber seemed to suspend its respiration. During that exact same year, the citizens of Cuba flooded the public avenues. Thousands assembled. They chanted Libertad. They chanted We desire liberty. They were physically assaulted, detained, and vanished. The identical atrocities my grandfather recounted from 60 years prior, recurring simultaneously on live broadcast. His vocal delivery remained remarkably steady, devoid of overt rage, projecting the specific steadiness of a man articulating a burden he has shouldered for an extended period. I stated publicly, because someone was obligated to do so, that the Cuban populace was revolting against 62 years of socialist deception, authoritarianism, and suffering. Your reaction, Congresswoman, required multiple days to materialize, and upon finally issuing a statement, you refrained from condemning the authoritarian regime. His palm rested atop the notepad, completely flat and motionless, evoking the precise manner his father's hands likely rested against the wooden bar upon concluding a long shift. You condemned the United States. You condemned our trade restrictions. The citizens filling the avenues were pleading for liberation. And you engineered a method to make the narrative about us. Her visual focus plummeted to the base of her microphone. Her right hand grasped it, not with the intention of speaking, but desperately seeking a stationary object for physical grounding. And furthermore, there occurred the event in Munich. During February of the current year, you participated in the Munich Security Conference acting as a representative of this nation. While being recorded, standing before international heads of state and foreign envoys, you declared that Venezuela is geographically situated south of the equator. He paused deliberately. Venezuela is located north of the equator. That does not constitute an ideological debate, Congresswoman. That is basic cartography. A solitary auditory reaction emanated from the gallery, an individual releasing a breath. It was the specific type of exhalation containing a suppressed chuckle that is deliberately stifled. You are ignorant of Venezuela's geographic location, yet you feel sufficiently informed to advocate for the regime that controls it. Rubio inserted his fingers between the final pages of his notepad. He located the edge of a specific item and extracted it with deliberate slowness. It was a photograph, diminutive and rectangular in shape. The pigmentation was faded, exhibiting the distinct hues characteristic of vintage photography. He positioned it on the desk directly before him, image facing upward. He handled it with extreme caution. He placed it with the reverence reserved for objects carried far longer than their structural integrity was designed to withstand. The recording equipment situated behind her left shoulder zoomed tightly on the object. The image displayed two individuals, a male dressed in a pristine white service jacket, identical to the attire worn by hotel lounge bartenders during the 1970s. A female stood beside him, slightly shorter in stature, wearing the unadorned blue uniform standard for hotel maids. Both subjects were gazing directly at the lens, neither displaying a smile, neither attempting to project an artificial persona. They were merely standing together in their occupational garments at the conclusion of their shift, projecting the weary, unpretentious dignity characteristic of individuals who had swapped one homeland for another and were surviving entirely through physical labor. His fingertips lingered briefly on the photograph's border. Subsequently, he withdrew his hand. He directed his gaze toward her. The gallery remained utterly paralyzed. The mature woman in the second row, who had offered the earlier nod of agreement, was leaning heavily forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The senator's assistant had seemingly ceased breathing altogether. Somewhere near the rear exit, a media professional lowered his secondary recording device because his hands lacked the necessary stability to operate it. Rubio delivered 10 precise words. "My parents were the working class. You are the brand." The legislative chamber plummeted into total silence. This was not the standard silence that momentarily bridges conversational gaps between debaters. It was the profound silence that permeates a residence immediately after the final inhabitant departs. Absolute. Enduring. The specific variety of silence one refuses to shatter because doing so would necessitate acknowledging the reality of the preceding events. No individual shifted. No individual vocalized a single sound. Her eyes remained fixed squarely upon the photograph. She avoided looking at him. She avoided looking at her folder. She stared intensely at the two individuals in their work uniforms who had never requested public recognition. Her respiration hitched once a brief gasp, resembling the initial phonetic sound of a word she proved incapable of completing. Then her physical bearing transformed. Her shoulders slumped downward. Her spinal column, which had maintained an upright posture throughout 2 solid hours of intense interrogation, silently surrendered its structural rigidity. Her fingertips located the edge of her folder's cover, and the folder shut. It was not forcefully slammed or aggressively shoved. It simply closed, mimicking the quiet shutting of a door in a residence where an individual has departed with no intention of returning. The committee chairman held his silence, the spectator gallery held its silence, the recording devices maintained their focus, and the vintage photograph remained positioned on the desk, facing upward, situated squarely between a small pocket notepad and a firmly shut folder. Two individuals clad in occupational garments staring out from 4 decades in the past at an audience that had just witnessed the only sentence of genuine consequence. Now, permit me to articulate a reality that no mainstream television commentator will dare express regarding Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She is remarkably intelligent. She is exceptionally industrious. She ranks among the most profoundly talented communicators of her specific demographic cohort. And that constitutes the precise crux of the dilemma because, at a specific juncture in recent history, the American political landscape ceased prioritizing tangible construction and began prioritizing verbal performance. She comprehended this cultural transition more thoroughly than nearly any of her peers. She recognized that a viral video fragment wields more influence than a drafted legislative bill. She understood that a punchy social media caption generates more power than a formal committee vote. She realized that if a politician can successfully manufacture the emotional perception that they are battling on behalf of the public will rarely demand evidence of actual legislative victories. And this strategy proved highly effective. It functioned flawlessly until an individual equipped with a small pocket notepad seated himself opposite her and posed an inquiry she proved utterly incapable of resolving with a clever social media caption. This is the genuine subtext of that legislative hearing. It did not concern Amazon. It did not concern the Green New Deal. It did not even fundamentally concern the nation of Cuba. It centered entirely on an underlying inquiry that has been steadily escalating within this country for an extended duration. An inquiry that no individual possessing a broadcast microphone possessed the courage to articulate. Who is authentic? That remains the ultimate inquiry. Not who leans politically right, nor who leans politically left, not who supports which specific faction regarding which specific legislative policy. Who is genuinely authentic? Who has actually endured the specific life experiences they publicly profess to advocate for? Who has legitimately acquired the metaphorical wounds they display for the cameras, and who merely co-opted those wounds from another individual's existence, draping them over themselves like theatrical attire? The senator did not practice his response to that inquiry. He extracted it from between the translucent leaves of a small pocket notepad, because that reality has resided within him for 4 decades. It resided there during his childhood while observing his father return exhausted from tending the bar. It resided there while his mother organized linens at a luxury hotel she lacked the financial means to patronize as a guest. It resided there while his grandfather relaxed on a Miami patio and discussed a homeland that was violently stripped from them under the banner of the exact same ideological terminology the Congresswoman prominently features on her campaign literature. That vintage photograph was entirely distinct from a theatrical prop. It served as undeniable documentation of a life that was genuinely experienced. Now, allow me to address you, the viewer, directly, because this concluding segment is intended for your consideration. You instinctively recognize the distinction. You have perpetually recognized the distinction between the individual who actually performs physical labor and the individual who merely publishes social media content regarding physical labor. The distinction between the individual who operates heavy commercial vehicles and the individual who authors academic policy documents concerning transportation workers they have never personally encountered. The distinction between the guardian who prepares daily meals at 5 in the morning and the political figure who stands behind a speaking platform which costs more to lease than your personal vehicle is valued at and declares, "I comprehend the struggles of working families." You did not require this specific narrative to educate you regarding that reality. You have possessed that knowledge throughout your entire existence. You acquired it by observing your parents, who acquired it by observing theirs, and not a single one of them ever required a social media profile to validate their struggles. What you truly required was to witness someone articulate it audibly, recorded on camera, directly to her face, within an environment where she was entirely unable to abruptly transition to a commercial break, unable to utilize social media to maneuver out of the confrontation, and unable to rebrand the disaster as a political movement, a cultural moment, or a trending digital hashtag. 10 specific words. That was the entirety of what was required. And the fundamental reason those 10 specific words resonated with such devastating force is not because they were intellectually clever. It is simply because they were undeniably accurate. And the individuals seated in that spectator gallery inherently recognized it. And the audience observing from their residences inherently recognized it. And at this precise moment, somewhere within a private residence, an individual is listening to those specific words and concluding, that is the exact statement I would have delivered. That embodies the absolute distinction between an artificial political persona and a genuine human existence. A persona necessitates a captive audience. An authentic existence does not. His parents never possessed a captive audience. They merely possessed exhausting occupational shifts. If this narrative successfully articulated the sentiments you have been internally harboring, distribute it. Because the demographic that most desperately needs to hear this message is the exact demographic that no one else is currently producing content for.